Hey there, this is Seth Schaefer from Team Just Cause Robotics, and today's video will be answering the question that seems to always be on everyone's mind: just how much do Battlebots cost? Well, I'm here to give you some answers. I sent a survey to all of the teams that either applied to, were accepted to, or competed in the 2020 season of Battlebots. Spoiler alert, for the season ahead, and I got back many answers from many notable teams, including the Season 5 champion robot, Endgame. However, before I tell you the answers that these teams gave, let's first address an important topic. What exactly were the questions? I'm going to show you the exact form I sent to teams, and I'm going to explain why I asked the questions that I did. First off, I respected everybody's privacy to the utmost extent. I know that it's difficult for people to talk about the finances that they had available to them during a pandemic when many people lost their jobs and are experiencing financial hardship. So I gave people the out of saying that they didn't want to be specifically named if they refused to be singled out. So they have the option of not being singled out, and instead I could just say, bot A, who asked not to be named, spent $50,000 or what have you. Nobody chose this third option, so a third of the teams that responded to the survey did choose the second option, but 67% of the teams that responded said that their team can be singled out, and I can address them by name as an example and give their answers to all of the following questions. So thank you very much to all the teams who responded, and especially those who said they could be singled out as examples. I had responses from some very notable teams, including Malice, who famously posted a cost breakdown, and we'll be talking about not just the cost of building their robot, but the other expenses that they experienced and why it was so expensive, and more. Second, while fans often ask how much it costs to build a robot, I feel it's a lot fairer to ask how much it costs to compete on Battlebots. So if somebody was actually looking to get into this sport, they would know, what exactly they actually have in store in terms of how much money they need to fork over, especially if they might not get any sponsors, which, other spoiler alert, some teams don't have sponsors. In fact, the Battlebots team I'm a part of, the Bloodsport team, we actually came into the 2020 season of Battlebots with no sponsors. So this number can be very high, and sometimes none of it is covered by sponsorship. So if you want to build a Battlebot, you might need to fork over the amount of cash that some of the teams list for this question. There are many ways that these costs can be reduced. I'll talk a bit more about that as I go through the results, but I want to say one major thing up front. Team Madcatter, who also responded to this and said they could be singled out, put in their response that their robot would have cost triple what it did if they had not done all of the machining themselves. However, the time commitment for doing that and access to a machine shop capable of doing that isn't always something that just anybody can guarantee, and we'll talk about exactly how many man hours were spent building these robots also later on. Teams like Malice, who were forced to outsource and to make everything a rush order to get all their parts as soon as possible and use domestic machining as opposed to China machining, they paid out the butt for their parts. Bloodsport, for instance, we have a 72-pound billet chassis that's a single piece of aluminum, and that part costs about $2,000 a piece, even having ordered it months ahead of time to be machined in China. So that just gives you a sense of scale. That's a single part of our robot, and we bought 3 of those so that we would have spares to compete in the 2020 season. Alrighty. My third question was a contentious one. How much do you estimate was your out-of-pocket expenses to compete? Now, I did not put this as a required question for basically the same reasons I said with relating to COVID. I know that some people might scoff at the fact that somebody could have afforded to spend like $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 or more out of pocket when they're struggling to make ends meet right now. But fortunately, only a single team actually did not answer this question that I surveyed out of the 15 responses that I got. So I can give you some real numbers here on how much was not covered by sponsorship, essentially, is what this is. Now, I'm saying to compete as opposed to just build a robot because realistically, if you are on the East Coast and you need to pay to freight ship a crate that weighs 1,000 pounds to California, that can add significant cost to the overall cost to compete. and you also have to pay for food and lodging in some cases. I will say up front, though, this season was a weird one because Battlebots, due to COVID, they wanted to streamline the process for everybody. So they actually paid for and reimbursed for COVID testing. They paid for the travel expenses. They paid for everybody to be put up in a hotel, and we all had the option of taking a lodging stipend instead and spending that on Airbnb, which is what the Bloodsport team did and many other teams. I think possibly more than half of the teams did. And we also had meals provided to us for free for lunch and dinner at the event. However, in seasons past, that was not always guaranteed. So keep in mind that these numbers, these out-of-pocket costs may even be a little low, as well as the total cost to compete may even be a little low compared to what it might be even for next season or future seasons. All right, so next we have what a lot of fans of the show would probably want to ask many builders. How much does it cost to build a single robot? Basically, if you were to say, if I want to build a Malice, how much would it cost? If I want to build a Bloodsport, how much would it cost? If I want to build a Rusty, how much would it cost, you know? So building a bot as opposed to having all the spares that you actually need to survive, 7 fights in a tournament, though, very different things. So every single team spent more than the cost to build a single robot. Some many times more, some just a little more. And I'll get into exactly how that played out in a bit. And then what percentage of your cost to compete was covered by sponsors? This is a big one that I asked because I thought this would range pretty wildly, and I knew for a fact that teams like my own had 0% of their costs covered by sponsors. But what I wasn't expecting was that there were actually a couple teams that responded that had more than 100% of their costs covered by sponsors. That said, they were vastly outnumbered by teams that said 0% of the costs were covered by sponsors. So I'll talk about the average cost that was covered and name a few of the teams who were really good at getting sponsors so that maybe they can provide help to the rest of us in the future. Next, how many man hours would you estimate your team spent designing and working on the robot before you arrived at Battlebots? Why did I ask about before arriving at Battlebots? Well, there are 2 reasons for this. Number 1, I was surveying teams that were accepted to compete primarily in the 2020 season, but as you know, many international teams who competed in Season 4 did not appear in Season 5, even if they were accepted to return. So a lot of teams paid to build a robot and paid for the tooling that they needed and the parts that they needed and the metal that they needed and the spares that they needed, but just didn't end up getting to the competition and competing. So because Battlebots paid for the travel, lodging, and most of the food, these numbers shouldn't be too far off from teams that built a robot but didn't compete, because I'm asking about expenses before arriving at Battlebots rather than the expenses during the event. I also didn't ask about after arriving at Battlebots for work hours because I wanted to make sure that this was not skewed upwards by all of the teams who were in attendance, because basically every team spent like at least 8 hours a day for 2 weeks at Battlebots. So that would instantly add like over 80 hours of time spent on the robot to every single person who was competing, but that 80 hours wouldn't be added to every person who wasn't competing. So and it also would be skewed based on how many team members were there, because if there's 8 people on a team versus 3 people on a team, and both of those are people who are spending 40 hours a week, then like that inflates pretty drastically. I did, however, say man hours because I wanted to encapsulate how many people and how much time is spent prior to the season, even if it was a team where 8 different people are doing things, because at least with my team, it seemed like Justin Marple, the captain, he was doing the vast majority of the work with other teammates kind of helping out here and there. But there are some teams where they had a compressed timeline. So like they had a month and they would get like 4 people who all come together and work for like a solid month. So I still wanted to encapsulate how many hours were spent preparing, not just like what the timeline was, like 1 month was spent, 2 months was spent, 6 months was spent, because it's easy for one team with 5 people to spend, 1,000 hours over the course of a month, whereas another team might have spent 500 hours over the course of 6 months. So, I thought this would be a better idea for just how much time dedication is required to actually get a competitive Battlebot or any Battlebot into the season. Finally, I asked for additional information, so this is where I heard from Madcatter saying that their machining costs were lowered by doing things themselves. This is where I got some tips about sponsorship or ideas for, how much of a percentage of sponsorship was covered in the past for one team versus this season, stuff like that. I also have cost breakdowns for 3 of the robots, including Endgame, Malice, and also Jackpot, even though I don't have a survey response from them, but we can glean some information from that. So without further ado, let's get into the numbers. So first off, this is my team, Bloodsport. I don't actually have survey response from Justin Marple, and he did most of the financial costing for our robot. But just for a sake of comparison, I'm going to talk about what I would roughly estimate to be some of the numbers for Bloodsport. So I know that the overall cost to compete was somewhere in the realm of $30,000 to $40,000 for season 5. He also published on our website that for the 2019 season 4 robot, it was about $30,000. So that didn't change a whole lot. Out-of-pocket expenses this season were identical to the cost to compete because we had 0 sponsors. The cost for a single robot, somewhere in the realm of probably $10,000 to $12,000. I would say maybe 15,000 would be pushing it, but we have very expensive electronics and didn't get enough electronics to build 3 whole robots. We did get enough chassis to build 3 whole robots, and we had enough weapons for 5 robots. And some of the weapons, like our tri-bar, individually cost multiple thousands of dollars. So our cheapest weapon was the disc at about $500, and the tri-bar I think was about $3,000, waterjet by Team Waiachi out of 3/4 inch S7 tool steel, and then heat treated locally in Massachusetts. The heat treat process pretty significantly adds to the cost. So AR500 weapons like the disc that come pre-hard, it's way cheaper. Also laser cutting in general is way cheaper than the water jetting from Team Waiachi. Sponsored percentage, Bloodsport, we had 0%. So I've helpfully filled in our minimum here because you can't really get lower than 0%. And man hours of work, I put in the average that I got from survey from all teams. I don't know exactly how much Justin spent by himself on design work and stuff, but I know that he and I both worked together for a number of hours, and I would estimate that we would probably be in the realm of a good 400 to 800 hours, though I have no idea where in there our team would be. And then our competing to bot ratios, I just filled these in as part of the survey data. I just came up with this metric as a way to roughly estimate like how many times the cost of a single bot it was for the team to compete. So in other words, if all of the competing costs were put into spare parts for the robot, this would be how many robots you could build with that amount of money. So I've just filled in these numbers. You can see the range is pretty significant. The minimum was 1.18, the maximum 3.75, the average 2.6 basically. So on average, a team had to pay for enough money, to have enough money to pay for 2.6 robots worth of parts. So now let me get into the specifics. For each question, I'll go over the average, I'll tell you the maximum and give you the bot that was that maximum, the minimum and the bot that was that minimum, and then quickly go over the second and third place for the highest and lowest. So here we go. All right, before I get started on the data, let me just say that if you'd like to support the Bloodsport team, we have a web store. You can go there. It's at bloodsportbattlebot.com/shop. And we're selling stickers. And if you happen to really enjoy looking at our robot and have a ton of money, you can buy it and fund our entire season 6 budget if you'd like in the process, because that would be pretty sick. Also, even if you don't have $40,000 and you for some reason don't want to buy 700 stickers, you can donate some amount of money to us directly if you would like to support the robot. Oh, and one other thing. I also would like to say that the way that I phrased the questions was very specific that I sent to the builders. So I was not asking for people to tell me for their competition costs how much money they spent, because that is the same as out of pocket. I asked them to estimate not just, how much they would have spent if they were spending the money that sponsors gave them in cash. I was asking them how much it would cost to buy the machining time for parts that sponsors made for them for free, because it's actually much more common to get parts sponsors and machining services as sponsors than to get cash handed to you. So the value, if somebody were to go to, say, like Xometry and order like a chassis, like a billet chassis, like Shatter has Prismeer, which is a machining service. That's one of their sponsors, and Prismeer made like a billet chassis for them, just similar to the one for Bloodsport. That would have probably been like some number of thousands of dollars out of pocket if Prismeer wasn't giving it to them for a reduced cost or free. So just to clarify on that point. Alrighty, on to the data. The average cost to compete for the 15 teams that I got survey responses from. This is also converted to US dollars from teams like Endgame that were international teams and gave me numbers in New Zealand dollars, for instance. The average cost overall, $29,669. The minimum, the least that any team spent was $4,500. And the maximum that any team spent was, and this is where it gets scary, guys, $94,000. Just to put this in perspective for you, let's just see here. Yep, that is a Mercedes S-Class, and the MSRP for that car is $94,250. So some pocket change on top of a Mercedes-Benz S-Class gets you a Malice to the Battlebots 2020 competition. Malice, of course, already sent in a full cost breakdown that you can take a look at on Facebook. I've done you the favor of upscaling it here so that it's actually readable. This is what their total cost breakdown looks like, and you can see their frame cost $42,813.71. Now, the reason for this being so expensive is because, similar to Bloodsport, they have a gigantic piece of aluminum being machined, but unlike our team, where we went to China and had like 3 months for them to get us the parts, they were told they were accepted to Battlebots in like April, and at the time Battlebots was scheduled for March filming, so they had to scramble. They had to get a US domestic company, and they had to rush the US domestic company to machine parts for them. All of those things together made the cost multiply many times what it might have been had they been able to get the same parts machined in China with 3 months lead time. But that just goes to show the huge disparity in cost differences. Whereas Malice's frame, they got 2 frames for $43,000 almost. Bloodsport got 3 frames for a total of around $6,000 or $7,000. All right, the cheapest robot was not, or the cheapest all-in competition cost was not Jackpot, actually. Jackpot, they said that they spent about $7,000. We actually have a much lower cost of $4,500 from none other than Smee. Yes, Smee is actually a very inexpensive robot. And on top of this, they had the lowest competing cost to bot ratio of only 1.18. So an individual robot was almost the entirety of their whole competition cost. They did not have very many spares. And the captain of Smee, Joe Fabiani, wrote me a helpful note saying that the cost of one Smee wedge was about 50% of what they spent on the entire robot. So again, we're talking machining costs here. He got this UHMW wedge machined in several segments in China from plastic, and it's a complicated part, but China machining is cheap, and if you have the time for it, it's even more cheap. So there you go. Other honorable mentions go to the second cheapest competition costs of $8,000. That would be a Bale Spear. We have the third cheapest competition costs of $8,300 US from Nelly the Ellibot. And then we have the second most expensive of a team that chose not to be named, $60,000, and third most expensive at a converted to US dollars, $48,240. And that is your 2020 champion Endgame. So the champion robot, $48,240. So there you go. Out-of-pocket expenses. So this is how much was not covered by sponsors, once again. So basically, if you chose to try and compete on Battlebots and you got some sponsorship, but not all of your costs covered on average, that was the case, you might be expected to spend this much amount of money out of pocket. The average here, $13,259. Wow, I can't type. But $13,259 out of pocket, not reimbursed by sponsors, on average per team. Most people do not have this number sitting around in a savings account happily to be thrown away on a robot. So that's how much it costs on average. However, the maximum competition costs that weren't, reimbursed by sponsors, again, Malice. They had no sponsors, no 0% sponsorship. So that whole $94,000 cost was all out of pocket for them. Please get yourselves some Malice merch, you guys. They could really use the money, and they have a pretty sick merch store with so many merch options. It's not even funny. I honestly think they could have easily doubled their competition costs just on stocking up merch. So you guys should probably buy some of it. Next, minimum, the cheapest out-of-pocket costs, $0. Surprisingly enough, there were 2 teams that responded to my survey that said they spent $0 out of pocket. One of them chose not to be identified. The other one was P1, fellow DECA Research and Design employee Brandon Zielinski as the captain of this robot, and he managed to acquire enough sponsorship with stickers plastered all over the robot telling you exactly who they are to cover 102% of the cost of his competing budget. So good job, Brandon. Hopefully we can get some helpful tips from you. However, he was not the most sponsored robot. The other one that had 0 out-of-pocket costs on my survey responses had 120% of their out-of-pocket costs covered, but that captain wrote me a note saying that they have competed in at least one past season where they did actually have to spend significant amounts of money out of pocket, and some years the stars align, which was the case this time around. Cost for a single robot. So how much did you have to fork over to make one robot's worth of parts? The average here, $11,093. The maximum was, again, Malice. So Malice, one Malice, $35,000. And the cheapest robot, as I already alluded to, as far as I know, because Jackpot didn't respond to my survey, is again Smee. So Smee, a single Smee, is a lowly $3,800, considerably less than the purported $4,000 that one Jackpot costs. So the other cheaper single bot costs we have here would be Nelly the Ellibot at about $4,000 US. And I also actually have a cheaper robot than Smee. So correction for a team that chose not to be identified once I make a currency conversion because they were an international team. It is actually $3,200 US roughly that the cheapest team that responded to my survey cost. Though I cannot tell you who it is, and I will also not tell you what currency that I have to convert from to give you too many hints there. So next up, we have sponsored percentage. Oh, I should also talk about some of the other expensive robots. So the second most expensive single bot cost robot, another team that chose not to be identified at $25,000. And the third most expensive single bot cost converted from New Zealand dollars was Endgame at $14,400. So that is $14,400 for Endgame. I'll also say the out-of-pocket costs for Endgame. They were actually one of the most sponsored robots, surprisingly, and they had an out-of-pocket cost of a measly $4,320 US. So there's your point of comparison there. They paid $48,240 to compete, and a tenth of that, less than a tenth of that, being their out-of-pocket costs, because they were able to get hella sponsored by the University of Auckland, New Zealand, which unfortunately here in the US wouldn't really be possible for the Bloodsport team here. But just to give you some comparisons for the robot that won the whole thing, didn't necessarily cost them a whole lot, but also keep in mind they've competed in several past seasons, and I can almost guarantee you they had less sponsorship money for some of those. Next up, we've got sponsored percentage. So which teams had the most sponsorship, which had the least? I can tell you right now, there is a 5-way tie out of the 15 teams I surveyed at 0%, and that makes 6 if you count the 16th team of Bloodsport, where I can tell you prior to Battlebots, we had 0 sponsorship. Now, while we were actually at Battlebots, we got some help from our good friends at Send Cut Send. So Send Cut Send actually gave us a few $100s worth of parts for free while we were at the competition. But prior to arriving at Battlebots, we had 0% of our costs covered, and that also amounts to far less than 10% of the total competition costs for the team. So I still put 0 for prior to the competition, how much we had costs covered. But you should check out Send Cut Send. They're pretty much the best place to go if you want to get parts cut for Net Weight, Beetle Weight, any of the smaller weight classes, or even a Battlebot. So we might be using them to cut even our weapons for next season, some of them. Next up, sponsor percentage. So the most sponsored team was, as I said before, a team that chose not to be named with 120% of their costs covered. However, on average, the average team got 45% of their costs covered. So your average cost being, $30,000 almost, $29,960. So we've got the average of $29,960. Whoops. Average of $29,960. Whoops, $29,690. 669 actually. So they averaged $29,669 to compete, and of that, on average, less than half of it was paid for by sponsors. This average is skewed pretty low because there are 5 teams that had 0%, but then 2 teams with over 100%. So that is what it is. Endgame is tied for the third highest. So Endgame had 90% of their costs covered by sponsorship. Tied with them, a team who chose not to be identified. And below that, one team that also chose not to be identified at 80%. The Slammo team actually surprised me because they had 70% of their costs covered. So for Slammo, I thought they were an interesting case because this is a robot that had some of the highest number of man hours put into it, and also one of the higher costs to compete. So Slammo, they wrote that it was $30,000 to compete. A single bot was worth about $8,500 worth of parts. So they actually had one of the biggest ratio, one of the highest ratios between how much they spent on the competition as a whole and how much they spent on a single robot. And they, despite being called Team Mobot and having Mobot plastered all over their robot, did not actually have 100% of the costs covered. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Other robots with low numbers that were not 0, we have Nelly the Ellibot here with 10% of their costs covered by sponsors. We've got Cobalt with 20% of their costs covered by sponsors. So the Cobalt team is considerably more expensive than Nelly, however, Nelly being one of the cheapest overall costs to compete. For Cobalt, they said that their preparations for the Season 5 amounted to $20,000. and out of pocket they spent 12,000. So they have 40% of their costs covered, or sorry, 20% of their costs covered by sponsorship. That seems a little off to me, but that's what they put here. So yeah. Then we have other teams in the middle. So SME wrote that 50% of their costs were covered by sponsorship. So they had about $2,200 out of pocket. Still not an insignificant amount of money, but much lower than most of the teams who didn't have 100% of their costs paid for. And then we have, let's see, Mad Catter. So going 3-0 in the Fight Night rounds and doing very well overall this season. They had 40% of their costs covered by sponsors. They were also one of the more affordable costs to compete of the teams, but one of the higher out-of-pocket costs of $10,000 out of pocket because they were not able to get 100% of their costs covered by sponsorship. And they also wrote a note saying labor costs are killer, so they spent a ton of labor themselves instead of paying for things to be manufactured in other places or paying other machining services for it. And they said they would have paid about triple if they had paid for machining service. Last but not least, let's talk about man hours of work that the teams spent on their bots. So these are probably going to be pretty rough estimates because no one really keeps track of this directly, but just to get some sense of how much work goes into these robots, the two teams with the highest number of man hours put into their robot, the average being 737 hours, mind you, 2,000 hours. And this is a two-way tie between Slammo, 2,000 hours, 2,000 man hours of work going into this, testing over many, many months leading up to the competition, and Endgame, your Season 5 champion. Turns out hard work can pay off. 2,000 man hours worth of work. Following in a somewhat close third place, though, again, Mad Catter with 1,500 hours, 1,500 man hours of work. Next up, we've got the ones with the least man hours of work going into them. So the minimum that I got as a response to my survey was 100 man hours. Now, mind you, 100 may seem paltry compared to 2,000 or even the average of 700, but this is a hobby and we aren't getting paid for it. And that is 2.5 weeks of full-time work being put in for free. So you can account for that how you will, but I feel like that is serious dedication to a hobby and a sport that you love just for the hell of it, compared to what most people would be willing to do for their hobbies. And the average, of course, being so much higher than that as well. So the teams that wrote to me that they had 100 man hours spent were Smee and Balespear. I also had a couple others that wrote in that they had 200 man hours spent on their bots who both chose not to be identified. One of those actually did not compete on Season 5 though, so that may have skewed their values down a bit. I also had Nelly the Ellie bot with another pretty close number, but I couldn't nail down the exact number because there seemed to be some dispute between the team captain and one of the team members as to how much time was spent, and I don't know if their numbers were supposed to be added together or not. So question mark there, somewhere between 150 and 300 hours on Nelly, I would estimate. Also keep in mind they also weren't able to compete, and they were also working in the UK during COVID lockdown, which was a lot more strict than the US COVID lockdown, so that probably accounts for an inability for the team to gather together and actually get a lot of work done to some extent. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything here that I wanted to talk about. So if you have any questions, definitely let me know in the comments down below if any of these numbers really surprised you or seemed extremely high, extremely low compared to what you expected. Definitely tell me in the comments down below. And if you'd like for me to do more investigations like this, let me know in the comments as well. After that, if you like this video, click like. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. And as always, thanks for watching.